So we're about to get started, folks. Just waiting for our live stream to begin. Elle, could you get the door? Thank you. All right. Let me make sure that's yes. No worries, no worries. We're all good. All right. So welcome everyone. Whoops. I need a cameraman. Welcome everyone to this launch of The Many Passions of Michael Hardwick with our author Martin Paget and John Fulker. My name is Greg Newton. I am the co-founder, along with my partner Donnie Jokum, of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division. That is the space you are in right now. And the Bureau is an all-volunteer independent queer bookstore that Donnie and I founded in 2012, and that has been here at the LGBT Center since 2014. We are all volunteer, as I mentioned. We're being helped tonight by Elle Chappelle, our volunteer. Thank you, Elle. And as an all-volunteer bookstore, we very much rely on sales and donations to keep this boat afloat. So we ask you to make a donation, especially if you know you won't be buying a book. If you're able to contribute something, we appreciate it. So there's some change in the bag. There is also a QR code if you'd like to give through Venmo. And anyone watching online can also give through Venmo at BGSQD. So I'll pass that around, and if it could just make its way back to Elle, we'd appreciate it. If you're not already on our email list and you would like to be, you can sign up for that at the back of the room or on our website, bgsqd.com, and you'll get an email every other Monday about our many upcoming events. And it being June, we have a lot of events coming up, so please check out our calendar on our website or on that newsletter. Our regular business hours are Wednesdays through Sundays from 1 to 7 p.m. And then we often stay open later when we have events such as this. And I think that is all the background you need. I'm gonna, before I introduce our panelists, or our guests rather, I wanted to read a land acknowledgement. So the Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community House's Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-native people who wish to acknowledge the legacies of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. And you can find out more at mannahattafund.org. The Bureau also recognizes Palestinian liberation as a fundamental part of our collective queer liberation. And we encourage you to take one of our free, new, and exciting little zines about why we feel it's important for queers to speak out in solidarity with Palestine, especially at this moment. So you can grab one of those either at the counter or in the back corner. And now, for our event. Martin Paget is the author of A Night at the Sweet Gum Head and The Many Passions of Michael Hardwick. Recipient of a Lambda Literary Fellowship, his writing has appeared in the Oxford American, the Paris Review, and Washington Post, among other publications. He lives in Pensacola Beach, Florida. John Fulker covers advanced auto technologies and policy as a reporter and analyst. I can say that word. So we'll be talking about a lot of car stuff tonight.
Don't read the whole thing.
Okay, should I stop there? John will tell you more about himself throughout the event. Please give them both a very warm welcome. Thank you.
Okay. In this building, it's kind of fun to see some colleagues from our joint automotive reporting world, not necessarily an intersection, although a surprising amount of it. But thank you all for coming, and hello to our television audience, amongst whom I believe are some of my former comrades from ACT UP and other activist causes. So I got to know Marty. I have been given permission to call him Marty, because that's what I knew him as. Almost 20 years. He took me to dinner, yeah, November 2008 in San Francisco. We had dinner, and then you hired me in February 2009 to run a website about cars. I've always been a car nerd, so this was a good fit. And I didn't know a lot about you, and so I sort of asked around. I knew you were gay, you knew I was gay, but a friend said, you know, he's the only gay man that I've ever met that's proud of never having voted for a Democrat in his life. Things change.
And that was times past, and I think I have figured out who it is. It's gotta be Dan Neal.
Oh,
Because we had an argument at dinner once.
that would be Dan, yes.
And it was about that time where, I mean, look, just very straightforward, I had my political awakening very late in my life. When I realized I was one of the people who was being looked at as an other, who was being placed into a category where it was safe and legitimate to discriminate. And I'm glad that it happened to me finally, even at this stage of life, because it allowed me to do stories like these. And when I met John, I didn't know what John's trajectory had been until I started doing research on the books that really appealed to me. I got this great opportunity to start writing about the things that really grabbed my imagination. And when I did dive into archives like the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force at Cornell, I saw a name on the bottom of a page. It was John Volker's. John had helped organize several ACT UP actions, and I'm reading memos from Sue Hyde and from other activists, and there it's coming from John Volker. So I'd have to text him pictures. John, tell me about this. John, tell me about that. John, tell me why the police are so interested in you when they pull you over for speeding and they pull out a rap sheet.
Yeah, that was an arrest that didn't properly get dispensed with. I had actually done my piece. So it's a different story.
So we ended up having this intersection within our workspace that was unusual. Some of our work colleagues are here too. You know, the weird thing about the automotive industry, once it realized that it had queer people among it that were making valuable contributions, everybody became a little bit more comfortable about it, and a lot of us came out.
I'm so sorry, but we're having trouble hearing you.
I'm sorry, is that easier?
Saying,
Sure. So, you know, we work in a more open space now. So I'm privileged to have John to be here with me because he's a comfortable personality. We woke up basically together for 15 years online, so.
Well, and you hired me and made me a legit journalist, so thank you for that.
No, you did that. I
At
hired
50.
you.
But, all right, so this is your second book.
First I want to acknowledge the people who are here that
Oh, God.
I see, yeah. Number one, I want to acknowledge Michael's family and friends that are here today, including his nephew Robert and Robert's husband Roberto and Jorge, who took the picture on the back of the book that every time I saw it, I wanted that to be the cover image, that it just gave me this, peaceful way to approach a story that had so many aspects of it that were going to be so difficult to report. So thank you all for being here. And I also want to call out Marsha Harold in the back, who came in right at the end, and Robert, you should be here. Marsha worked with Michael at Squeeze, the nightclub where he concluded his art career. And we've never met in person, but we've talked so much, and I'm so glad to have you here. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, so you were, as you were saying.
Bad interviewer. I had read the first book, which was about a very specific time and place in Atlanta, a nascent gay club and drag scene, and it really ended just before AIDS. What led you to pick Hardwick for your next book?
I was fortunate that I knew about the case and that I knew so much of the history I'd already researched. I knew the places. It took place in my neighborhood. I knew the physical aspect of the story. I knew that I would have people in common because my husband knows everybody from Atlanta for the past 3 decades. We kind of dated to just after the city burned. Everything after that he has a contact for. Then when I started to research, I found Michael's friends online. I spoke with Marsha very early on in the process, but then I also found DJs that had worked with him at Backstreet and at the Cove. And then one night, I sat at the bar at the kitchen reading some notes and found a name and thought I should ask my husband, do you know Cliff Hoven, who was Michael's boyfriend in the late 70s in Florida? My husband said, yeah, Cliff used to run my office for 2 years in Atlanta in the 90s. And verified it with the picture, he knew him. It was just shocking that, of course, there was a connection between us. We've lived in the same spaces, and that's when I knew the story was absolutely possible for me to tell. It was not very far from my own.
So reading the book, the first thing I thought was, good God, there is this immense sprawling amount of material. You have the biography of an individual. You have an immense amount of court documentation, cases, hearings, opinions, all of which you have to wade through and then render into English that regular people understand, along with the actions that followed. How do you make that into a story? How do you cover that much ground? And even before that, how do you approach researching it? When you sat down, where do you go?
There are two different types of researchers. I think they're the ones who make careful progress through and sort of accumulate the story and end up on a very specific arc. I build mountains. I just pile everything in the corner, and then I start to dig through it like a picker. That's valuable, that's good, that can stay in the sort of maybe file, that can go in a document that I won't look at for 8 years, and then I'll finally delete it. I had some of that. There was one anecdote that I left out of this book too, and at one point I'm going to use it. It's a story about Diana Ross and I'm coming out and Nile Rodgers, and I tried to get it in here, and it didn't fit there either. But it's a great story. So later on, I first approached Robert and his family to see if they would agree to talk about this, because I didn't know if it was something that was still so hurtful that it was difficult to not just talk with a stranger about, but then to introduce it to the world again and try and give it this historic positionality and try and explain why it's still relevant and why it's frighteningly more relevant with each passing week. But then when I started to dig through the details, I realized, okay, I have 3 books here. There's a coming of age story that no one has heard really, other than family members. There's this Law and Order sort of procedural court story in the middle, and in researching that, finding out that, hey, Supreme Court justices are people and they have glaring flaws, and that there's a whole network of people that support them in their secession from the rest of society. They really kind of wall themselves off into a level of privacy that no one else is afforded in our government, and that was striking to understand the depths of how that affects our daily lives. The end of it is it's a story of a physical decline and a spiritual reawakening, and it's one of the more difficult things that I've had to write, because I felt like I was writing an obituary in sort of long form, and every time I fought that urge, write more about what he's thinking, what he's doing, what he's producing in his art, and how he's interacting with the world around him when so many people were so ill, and he had already lost 18 friends by that point to the epidemic. Trying to knit those 3 pieces together, I don't think I ever did, and I don't care. They act differently, and the tone of the book shifts dramatically between them because the story ends up getting overwhelmed. The one thing I knew the whole way through was that I'm not going to be one of the people who gives only 40 pages to his life, and I'm not going to cast aspersions on any part of the story because I'm a lawyer and I'm only seeing it through a legal lens, and I'm not going to flatten him out so he fits in a file folder. And that's what had been done in every case every time this case had been written about, they wrote about it only as a case.
But why Hardwick? What led you to Hardwick?
The story is so compelling. It's like I wrote in the beginning of the book, I didn't realize until I was halfway through research that for the first 1.5 years I lived in Atlanta, every time I had sex with somebody, I was a felon. That didn't change until November of 1998. So could have been me. Then I started interviewing friends, and he had this female friend who was dating a woman who came from a different cultural background than hers and could have been violently removed from it. It could have been her the night before had she been at Michael's apartment. She sometimes used it as a crash pad. A lot of people did. It could have been anyone that I knew at the time. And it was, Atlanta had its queer bubble that felt sort of secure until Michael's case really dismissed that idea. It built this machinery of law around him that only took one person to activate it. And when it did, it had these dramatic, these epic consequences.
When you were researching, what was, oh, yep, sorry, guys. Mike.
Pretend you're Stevie Nicks, John, just like the old days.
I heard that. What was one thing in researching the book that caught you by surprise?
By surprise, the moment realizing that Cliff had been this part of my husband's life before, but also the personalities of the members of the Supreme Court and how vividly that came across to the clerks and how little that's reported, because many people view the Supreme Court as this, it's the gods and goddesses on Olympus, that they're inviolable, that we shouldn't question their morality, how they're appointed, the really archaic way that they're named to the bench, and their personal failings too, that we were discussing right before we started, that every time that Warren Berger or another conservative justice compared queer people with drug addicts or prostitutes or sex workers or anyone that they considered to be lesser and less deserving, I should remind you that Justice Rehnquist had a Placidil addiction that put him in the hospital in 1981. He also had these issues with addiction in his lifetime and should have been more empathetic. But he was among the votes that was very clear from the beginning of the court case that would not be in Michael's favor. And to go with that too, that court cases are heard with almost no input about the people in their lives. There are some great passages from Harry Blackman, and he's wrestling with what was first majority opinion, which became the dissent, and how we don't know enough about the people and how we don't think enough about the law and how it affects people's lives when we enact it or decide it or overturn it. And that became the whole driving force for doing the book. We have to know more about the people who are willing to put themselves in these situations. We really should have better biographies of Dred Scott and Homer Plessy. We have better ones now that have been more diligently researched. We had this unique opportunity. There are still people here who knew Michael and loved him. It was time to get it down.
You wrote in the beginning of the book that there is a temptation to see Michael through one lens as a hero. You think he would have rejected that. Tell us more about that.
He was just a very sort of pragmatic and down-to-earth person. Whenever he was interviewed, it was very focused on the message, which he had spoken with attorneys at length. And after the case was decided, still reminding people, and I'm not doing this to be a celebrity. I don't want to be a star. You're free to use my name. I feel comfortable in my life where I can do this, where maybe a queer doctor or a queer lawyer had a lot more to lose. I had my family, I had my friends, I had a community that was willing to still employ me. He was willing to do that without taking on the trappings of celebrity. The police officer who arrested him later made a comment like, oh, is he selling t-shirts now? After the court case was over. It was very galling to read that and realize, he had to move a couple of times because he felt like he was threatened. He left Atlanta before the case was even heard at the Supreme Court because he felt like his life was in danger. And of course, he became one of the generation of people that ended up HIV positive. And still at the time of his case, it felt like nobody was doing anything with nearly enough speed or nearly enough interest or empathy.
I obviously connect in some ways to your descriptions of the actions, which are a small piece of the book, but the many actions around the decision and its aftermath. Sheridan Square, July 3rd, 1986, the March on Washington, Supreme Court, a couple of different demonstrations, the Democratic National Committee, July 1988.
Yeah.
What did you take away from researching those, which were very different from that Atlanta gay bubble?
So one thing I took away was that it was very clear that Atlanta was running sort of test scenarios for the Olympics that they were bidding on. right after really very, Atlanta always very pragmatic about how it looks on television. It did not count on ACT UP coming to town and kicking skinhead ass in the streets. Yay. There was this, the one thing that I carried through all of this and ended up being very specifically drawn out then is, 1984 is in the middle of the case as it's going through the procedurals. It is the year that everyone becomes sort of focused on this lack of privacy and the way that technology was driving us out of our homes and into the public square. At the DNC in 1988 in Atlanta, they had free speech zones. You are allowed to speak publicly about your ideas here, not over there. No, not there, go over here with everyone else. 30,000 square feet of asphalt in Atlanta in the middle of July, and no, nobody's gonna do that. I still think to this day that Atlanta has this, and Georgia had this unique position in the history of sexuality that probably really didn't want. But Thurgood Marshall wrote the opinion in Stanley v. Georgia in 1969 that you could watch pornography in your home. That had been tethered to, I think it was Olison in the 50s, where it was legitimate to send any kind of adult material through the mail, which meant that queer magazines could be distributed, which meant that queer people could see themselves in media and connect with other people. So the beginnings of this media presence in what would become this uprising against the anti-queer panic of the 80s had started to already formulate. Then of course, there was another case in the early 70s about a porno theater that didn't go the porno theater's way, but when Michael's case came along, it was this recognition that the South was a different kind of public sexuality, and that whether you're ready or not, it's time to litigate it.
There's a comment in there somewhere about the Mason-Dixon line, but I'm not smart enough to put it together.
Emphasis on the Dixon at the moment. Okay.
I'm sure I don't know what you're speaking
Sure,
of.
I
So.
don't know what you're speaking.
So you end your book with what is effectively a call to action. Did you plan to do that as this started out?
No, absolutely not. I was worried because a traditional biography is difficult enough to do, and Michael didn't write letters. I don't have any record of any cards or any notes that he wrote to his family, his sister, his nephew, his niece, anything left in that sort of ephemera. So it's really difficult, but that is really our job as historians, to find the pieces of lives that are not put into the public record. So it's great if you want to do like the 5th biography of Ulysses Grant. Have at it. Probably won't do better than Chernow, But who's doing biographies like this one? I felt like I had to do it because I had this geographic connection, I had these cultural connections, and then ended up discovering the personal connections to them. And it became, well, my editor says, she almost sent me to tears when we first signed it. She said, this is a great act of reclamation. So that is what I used to drive myself in finding out as much as I could about his life. And then when there were noticeable gaps, it gave me the chance to pull back and show you what queer life was like in that moment. And I think fortunately for me, one of those moments was in 1984. And it gave me a way to make some statement about the encroaching epidemic and how the queer community was starting to fragment because of the disease, and then also to comment on this lack of privacy or loss of privacy in this very public way, and to knit all those ideas together, because it was very clear that his case was going to set the legal and cultural code or tone for what was to come over the next couple of decades. If this case failed, it was going to influence the law for so long after it.
17 years, I think.
At least 17 years. A lot of people think that the case was, the inspiration for the organization that happened after it, March on Washington. That was the seed for the organizations that went home to start to work on Vermont civil unions, Hawaii civil unions, and eventually other cases like Romer v. Evans, which gave class status to queer people, then Windsor versus USA, federal marriage rights, then finally Obergefell. So I think Harry Blackmun always realized that once he knew he was writing a dissent, he had to write it powerfully in a way that people could platform on at the Supreme Court level. But all these activists who went home knew that they were going to have to resume the strategy of fighting for dignity at a state level. And you know, they had these very powerful nationally organizing moments and then had to go home and do work.
So when the reversal finally came, you write a little bit about the justice who essentially said, I blew it, and you write a little bit about the differing opinions.
Right.
Lay that out.
So if you're unfamiliar with the way that it went, the arguments were March 31st, 1986 in DC. There was a lot of optimism. Lawrence Tribe argued the case and was not sure. He felt like he was arguing what would eventually become a 5-4 loss, but he prepared for a win. Like he wanted to argue in the way that would win the case. By the way, he sends his regards tonight too. I asked him if he could be here tonight. He's in Boston. Couldn't be down for it, but it's one of the best interviews I've ever done in my life. Just completely enjoyable. When the case was first voted on in conference, Michael won. It was 5-4. Justice Lewis Powell had been convinced to go along with the liberal justices and uphold his right to privacy. In the words of one of the clerks, 2 days later, the Chief Justice got to him and convinced him to turn his vote the other way. Powell was this interesting guy. He was Virginia, Tidewater, had that sort of lazy Southern accent that I've tried to walk away from. Shows up every so often when I get real tired. He was convinced that Brown versus the Board of Education had been decided incorrectly. He was from a part of Virginia where black students were not integrated into the white school system for more than half a decade after Brown v. Board 2. So, but on the other hand, he had this striking tendency to choose clerks who were queer and not really acknowledge it or admit publicly that that was the case. But during this case, had very frank questions about, well, how do gay men have erections? He asked a person among his clerks who everyone knew to be queer, but that conversation had happened between the two men, but that the justice kept going to C. Capelchinis and asking him about queer sex and relationships, and the justice had already met his partner. He had just introduced him as a friend and was hoping to reintroduce him as his partner after the case was over. But then Powell changed his mind. And when the decision was announced, his opinion contained language that said, well, if Hardwick had been convicted, it would have been cruel and unusual punishment, and that would have been reason for him to go the other way on the decision. But the rest of the opinions on the conservative side were just littered with hateful language that is still galling today because it feels so familiar. And you know, among the people who worked on the case, I just remember Abby Rubenfeld telling me, I heard it and I couldn't believe it. So I asked them 3 times and I'd already started to cry, and then I went to my typewriter and I cried there for a little bit, and then I called Kathy Wild because she hadn't heard it yet. And you know, to some of them, it was the worst day of their lives. Powell in 1990 was asked at a NYU law school event whether he thought he'd ever made an incorrect decision in a case. He said, yeah, I think the opposite side had gotten the better of the opinions in Bowers v. Hardwick. So in a scathing letter that your colleague Sue Hyde wrote to Powell after that is memorialized in the NG, the Gay and Lesbian Task Force archives in Cornell. She goes for 3 or 4 pages and describes all the ways that he has denied people their humanity, and ends it by saying, to the effect of, the least you could do in this moment is to write letters to all the legislators considering repealing sodomy laws and tell them that you made a mistake that is affecting people's lives in this way. His response to the commotion was, I didn't think it was that important a case then. I don't think it's that important a case now. So his spidey sense, gaydar, I don't know what you call it, why would he approach the queer clerk and ask him about erections, coupled with this archaic stance on what people's core civil rights should be, and his ability to completely divorce those in his mind still stands out to me.
Moving back to the topic, the subject of your book, the man in the book.
Yeah.
If you somehow magically could meet Michael Hardwick for 5 minutes, what would you say to him? What would you ask him?
You know, I would wait to be invited to one of the parties at his house because that was apparently a pretty chill scene. I would really love to do that. You know, I'd be one of the people probably flirting with him at Backstreet and trying to make it to like half of first base and not making it, but he had this affable charm that lots of people thought he's interested in me because he's really nice and he's doing exactly what a bartender should do, and then treating them with respect even if he wasn't interested. I know you all know this, you knew him, but people just loved him. I have yet to hear a story from a person who said, well, he didn't want to go to bed with me, so even the guy who wouldn't go to bed with him told me, God, what a great guy. I always had a thing for bartenders anyway. When I moved to Atlanta, before I met my husband, I had hung out at this one place, and one night I stayed up till like 4 a.m. waiting for this guy to get off work. I was convinced he was going to be waiting for me too. He was not. So maybe I should just read you a text that I got the other day. I'm in touch with his friends from before the case, and if I still, I do still have it here. Your note to me literally made me tear up. I can't begin to tell you how much you touched my heart. Please know that although we've never met face to face, you would have definitely been part of our group. That right there should let you know how much you mean, not only to me, but to all my protectors holding a spot for me in that area at the club. That was Puss. She called herself the lesbian glue that held together their group. And she was, she's just one of many people who miss him. So that really touched me. I keep some of those texts on my phone when when I start to think about what's the next book. If I have success writing books like these, where I'm still in touch and still friends with people who I have made contact with over the years, that's a huge marker of success for me. And it gets easier as I go along because I'm moving more into a contemporary time frame where I can still reach out and text them and say, oh, by the way, did you see this? Here's another thing. Marsha, I don't know if you know this, but there's one surviving piece of Michael's art that is in a...
I read it.
Yeah.
And I remember it well. I worked at Squeeze for like 8 years, so I know everything he described in that whole place.
That's the hand, and Kim Carney has it in a storage unit somewhere down in South Florida. We're trying to figure out if there's a place for it in an archive somewhere. I would just love to see it and sit under it and try to think what would it have been like at Squeeze when that was the scene in South Florida. Yeah, so if you have questions, ask Marsha. And I should also bring up that I thought this was an Atlanta story because I only knew about the court case. It's a Florida story, and I had moved to Florida while I started researching this. So suddenly I am having to develop a second faculty with another state's queer history. And one of my author colleagues has a book coming out in 2 weeks, American Scare. It's about the Johns Committee in the 50s, essentially repeating the Lavender Scare on a state level. I think his book is out on the 16th. It's, he's not even a Floridian, and we're both writing about Florida because it's such fodder for this fascinating disparity between queer life as it actually is in context, and then the queer life that the government is trying to prosecute us for.
So, last question, then we'll open it up to Q&A, and at the end, Marty's gonna read a little bit, and then we'll sign books. Then Marty will sign books.
No, John's gonna sign them. Nobody knows why.
Yeah. All right, so last question. What's the next book?
Oh, so there is a book coming out, I hope by the end of next year. Rutgers Press decided to accept my dissertation. I went back to, this is such bad story. When I decided to do this book, I felt like I needed to know constitutional law theory as well as I could, so I went back to school and I got a doctorate in history and studied that. And that's the only way I felt comfortable talking to Pam Carlin and Larry Tribe on the phone, because they were just eviscerating you in court. While I was doing that, I read so much about television and how it was at its zenith. Do you get that joke? Yeah, somebody will get it here. Remember television?
The big box.
Television's influence on our lives, and there have been some great books about how sitcoms portray queer characters before really talking about them as queer. That book is called Hi Honey, I'm Homo, which is maybe my favorite title of a book in the last decade. There's, of course, Vito Russo's Celluloid Closet, that film, but no one had really looked at news and what we trust or what we think we trust. So I looked at some different valences of news, everything from like the lizard brain news of MTV up to Peter Jennings and Max Robinson on World News Tonight, and looked at how people perceived the queer community at the beginning of the decade and then how they perceived it and reflected it on us at the end of the decade. So that book is, the tentative title is something I would tell Joel never to do, like rip off somebody else's line. Right now it's called The Queer Revolution Was Televised. The idea is just to pick out these moments in queer history that are very visible. And the one that's striking to me that I remember when he was reporting from DC as a child, Max Robinson was the anchor on my local news. He died of AIDS in 1988. And it became this very visible way that that network was having to work within the story while they're also mourning their colleague. There was one night where Peter Jennings just said at the end of the broadcast after some latest piece of news, he said, just a reminder, AIDS is America's problem. And it was just very flat out, you know, if you need to get on board, we need to all do this together. And he was doing it almost in tears because his colleague had just passed away. So one of the unexpected heroes of that book will be Phil Donahue. I don't think he's unexpected, but he just was way out in front on portraying queer people as real people with real lives. And there's some Oprah in there and the different valences. I have another 2 or 3 book ideas in the works. There's one beyond that that has really captured me. And I just have to line up the right people to be able to do it, but it's probably not gonna come out until October 2029.
So give us the teaser. Don't tell us what it is, just the teaser.
A cultural history of Gen X.
Oh my.
Yeah,
Okay.
I got a lot of work to do. I'm supposed to have a job too, but you know, we'll see about that.
All right. Over to you folks.
Yeah,
Wave your hands in the air.
Any
You have an
questions?
author. Ask him questions.
what have I gotten wrong, guys? I know there's something back there.
Somewhat.
Okay. Yeah, go from the back forward, I guess.
Yeah.
Ken?
Ken.
I do have to leave unfortunately, but this was very enlightening, and I'm so proud of you with this. This is amazing.
Thank you.
So,
So is that a Paul Eisenstein? This is a comment rather?
well, I have a
Which-
4-part question.
You're totally allowed to do that. Yeah.
Sorry, auto industry jokes, folks.
Yeah.
Bear with us.
Good slideshow.
I think, Andrew, was that you?
Yeah, could you talk a bit about the 1998 case that made sodomy legal
Oh,
in Georgia?
yeah, I don't know much of it. You know, Georgia ended up keeping a portion of its sodomy law so that they could continue to use it to prosecute in cases of sexual battery or in cases of minors. But it had been argued at the state capitol ever since ACT UP came to town in 1990, and several people, including I think Cynthia McKinney was one of the first ones to promote a bill that would have done away with sodomy laws entirely. I can't exactly remember the case from 1998, but it had been that kind of bill had been making its way to the legislature every year, and finally a case that did a similar test. I think it was a straight couple bill. And because Georgia's law was worded in a way that could be used to prosecute straight or queer couples or anyone, the definition is very graphic. It's the genitals of one person and the mouth or anus of the other person. So, but you know, straight couples have protection under marriage and under other Supreme Court decisions. So it was still really pointed at queer people for the most part.
I think the lady in the
Emmanuel?
I'd like to hear more about the clerks who you were able to find and speak to, and I guess I'm surprised even to hear that they would be willing to pierce that, veil.
It's a great question because Danny Richmond, he teaches at Columbia Law, was more than willing to talk because Thurgood Marshall released his archives like a year and a half after he died. He did us a great national service by having that transparency and that clarity. And one of those memos in those archives was Daniel Richmond writing to Marshall in capital letters. All kinds of people do this. This is not just a queer issue. Paraphrasing. Pam Carlin, who was Harry Blackman's clerk during that term, we spoke for about an hour, and for the first half hour, I was so intimidated speaking with Pam Carlin, who was, shortlisted for a Supreme Court nomination. Just a brilliant woman. And after about a half hour, we just started to talk about politics, and it happened to be the independent state legislature theory was circulating at the time of the case, and we got into it, and I was like, all right, I got it. Now we're talking. The one who didn't want to talk at all was Mike Mossman, who wrote the memos to Powell, and then Byron White's clerk said, the justice shredded all of his paperwork. Number one, that's a work product, a federal asset, so he had a little wrong, but he said he shredded everything, and he always said that he wanted his opinions to stand for themselves and nothing else, so he wouldn't talk about it at all. Then you go to the Library of Congress and here's the files from Byron White, which don't include that much about Hardwick because he really didn't care that much about the case. He was never going to be convinced. The fact that so many were willing to speak was great because they had this rare inside view. I could not get to another clerk who worked with Marshall in 1987 during the March on Washington, but she's sitting on the Supreme Court bench right now and doesn't answer many questions. Elena Kagan was Marshall's clerk the following year, and I sent her a copy of the book hoping that she'll read it. She would have had an office view window of 500,000 people coming to DC to protest for something that she knew well from studying in law school. So,
Is it hard to find them? Can you make contact with them?
no, most of them are practicing attorneys still,
Oh,
so
okay.
just look for them. C. Cavachinas didn't want to talk again. He had delivered several interviews that really didn't vary at all because lawyers are good about that. There's an excellent book called Courting Justice, written by two women, Joyce Murdoch and Deb Price. And I ended up relying on that for a lot of this because they were able to speak with the clerks 15 years ago and get a lot of information because one was a practicing lawyer and they assembled this history of queer cases at the Supreme Court that is just, it's sterling. It is something everyone should read, and I recommended it to an Emory history professor who was looking for, compendiums on types of law to teach her class. So I had to find different stuff. When they had covered it so well, I wanted new details, and there were some interesting ones buried over at the Library of Congress.
I'm going to take the liberty. I was struck by your wrap up at the end on that topic of Supreme Court papers, talking about which justices lock them away for far past their lifetimes.
Yeah.
The people who want you to know and understand history will tell it to you. Those who don't will hide it, bury it, destroy it, or overturn it.
And I was drafting some pieces of that, which one person who was reading along with me thought I should just end it and not include the discussion about the Supreme Court at all. I averred. I was writing that while Dobbs was on its way to being decided. And when Clarence Thomas's concurrence came out and specifically called out all the due process cases, but kind of more specifically those oriented toward women where people, oh well, he gave me a news peg. I'd rather have not had it, but he said specifically we should look at all these cases with the same kind of wink and nod to far right conservatives to bring it on. Like, here's the cases we need to overturn. Start to work on those. I don't know if anybody read just yesterday, the Southern Baptist Convention voted overwhelmingly to pursue, in whatever way they could, overturning a Burkeville. We all kind of know that these things are in the air. Whichever one makes it to the court first is going to be heard. And like Larry Tribe said, I think there are 5 Robert Borks sitting on the court right now. There's just not a lot of hope. But I feel like this is hope because of the legacy that Michael left behind, and his nephew and his niece Simone, who is a fierce fighter for transgender people's rights in Florida, and his sister too, who I'm just still amazed that she does everything that she does. Eventually she'll have every piece replaced, like knees and hips and all that, robotic. But that's an enormous and tremendous thing to be able to pass on to a new generation of people. So this is just my way of putting it all in one place so it's easily digestible. And everyone under 25, queer people should read it and know it seems really bleak right now. And it might take a long time to resolve, but there's hope.
We have been here before.
Sadly.
Question.
Sort of on that note, I think it's hard to distance the parallels with the AIDS epidemic and then, this case going on.
Yeah.
Do you see today being different with the potential of the Supreme Court and what might happen there? But did the AIDS epidemic sort of empower or push sort of this additional, push for queer rights?
I'm going to repeat the question for our television viewing audience.
Yeah.
We hope you're out there. Essentially, correct me if I get this wrong, did the worsening AIDS epidemic give impetus to activism and organizing around the Hardwick decision?
And I will put it in the ways of the people who were there and experiencing it in real time, that in 1984, Jeff Levy had said publicly, AIDS needs a star. And needed somebody to translate and to create a path for empathy for people who otherwise wouldn't have it, but might have been receptive to it. You know, those near allies who needed something else to bring them closer. You know, we had to get them somehow. So in 1985, it's Rock Hudson, and he comes out publicly looking very ill, and then finally discloses he's very ill in October of that year. So the humanitarian aspect of the public sphere was engaged. Michael became the political part of it, and I think I was exchanging notes with Sarah Schulman about this, and she repeated to me a couple of times. She said, before then, it was clearly we were all just working to try and keep people alive, but after that, then we had this fuse that got lit. We had a clear political star that we could sort of center ourselves around and make the case that this is not just a moral issue. This is a clarifying moment for our legal prospects as citizens too. And if you can't understand one version of morality, try to understand the other one. We hope you understand both and why we should be protected by the Constitution. You know, when one of the protesters at the July 3rd, the relighting of the Statue of Liberty's torch and all that happened, she said, oh, the Constitution, funny us, we thought it applied to us too. It just sounded so hopeless to me in that moment, but what came after it was full of hope.
And the steady worsening of the epidemic from 81 through 87 led Larry Kramer to make his famous speech, looking at an audience like this and saying, half of you will be dead in 18 months. And that's what led to ACT UP. And so I think there was a lot of it cooking together, certainly the Hardwick decision and Hardwick's bravery in coming out.
So it was February of 1987 in Atlanta during a CDC conference where Michael Petralis donned the uniform that was meant to resemble Holocaust. Sorry, I'm sort of blanking out here. February 1987 in Atlanta stands up in Holocaust
Jail uniform.
Well, we don't call them victims. I want to use the correct.
Inmate or.
An inmate, how they would have been dressed, and stood up and basically did the precursor of "you're killing us." And within a few months, had started to organize. The March on Washington was one of the first places where there was sort of a visible organized, semi-organized, ACT UP presence. And Michelle Crone, who I hope I see in Provincetown next week, was one of the people who interceded. She had done all these kind of actions in upstate New York during the Seneca uprising and had said, well, wait, these things that you want to do at the Supreme Court, you want to throw blood on the steps, you want to handcuff yourself to the pews, you can't do civil disobedience like that. Here's how we're going to do it. And took to training people so that it would go smoothly and be this very visible moment. They expected like 50 people to show up to get arrested. 600 people were arrested. And they, weirdly enough, they took them to a place that I know very well. My father was a firefighter and he trained at this place in Blue Plains, DC. And they had so many people that they arrested on the Supreme Court steps, Michael included, that they had to bust them down there to process them. When Michael was arrested, there's a picture I wanted to use in the book. I wasn't able to because we couldn't ascertain the rights to it, but he's on the balls of his feet, standing in front of the statue of contemplation of liberty. And he's surrounded by other people who are being arrested, zip-tied in various ways, and he's just the solitary figure down here, the Supreme Court building looming over top of it. And it was the third time he was arrested in his life. And he wrote about it and said, you know, this is why I did this, because here are all the people going through the same life experience as me, being arrested around me just for being.
And a historical note there is that veterans of other movements, the anti-war movement, the feminist movement, the anti-nuclear movement, taught this new young generation of activists essentially safe, productive, nonviolent civil disobedience. We train people forever, and that sanity allowed a lot of it to come off without the kind of chaos that has happened in other events.
And to allow people to go home alive from March on Washington, because there were a lot of people with very advanced cases of complications from HIV, and they had to be put at the front of the line to march because they had to be near the bank building where they were refrigerating their medications to be administered every 2 hours. And just such thought and planning went into it. When I talked to Sue Hyde again, she said, you know, for things to change now, we have to recognize that it took 50 years to build the court of the conservatives' choice. It could take longer than that for us to do it, and I don't see that kind of organization yet, but the tools are there. I hope this looks like a toolkit in some ways.
That's as good a note as any to end on. Do we have time for Marty to read, I hope?
Yeah.
Oh, it's 8 o'clock already. I've kept you all out past your bedtime. No, wait a minute, I've kept myself out past my own bedtime. Let me, I'll read something shorter about the moment of the arrest, just because I think if you start from the point of fury like I did, it's easier to pan out and then read the greater story around it. This is, Michael had been ticketed on July the 5th for an open beer bottle coming out of the bar, the Cove, where he worked. The cop had written Wednesday, Thursday on the top of the ticket, but the court date was actually Tuesday. And it's probably a clerical system that they were using to file tickets as they were processed, but he missed his court appearance. So the officer filed the warrant right away and carried it with him in his squad car for 3 weeks. Michael went down to the courthouse knowing that somebody had stopped by his house to serve a warrant and paid it, got a judge to give him a $50 fine, took care of it. The court officer wrote that it was taken care of, but that the warrant needed to be taken care of. So as far as the police officer knew, he had a valid warrant. As far as Michael knew, he had taken care of the case. And as far as the court system knew, it was unresolved what was going to happen with the warrant. So that takes us to August 3rd, 1982. A few decks of Uno cards lay on the dining room table, their hands played out. The skunky smell of weed clung to the air. Even when the door swung open to welcome someone new or release them back into the night. It was a typical night at Hardwick's house, now that the hot Atlanta weekend had ended. His roommate had not been seen or heard from, but a crew of regulars hung out, including Puss, Woody, and Kirk. A new face from Mobile joined them that night. Dwight Sawyer had come to look for a place to live for himself and his partner Joey, who had stayed behind to pack up their house on Spring Hill Street. A burly, mustached, and balding man of 27, Dwight had squared eyebrows that framed a kind face. Joey, lean and brightly blue-eyed, had met Dwight in 1979 at the University of South Alabama, where Dwight had studied for a double major in music and math. Joey found him warm and unaffected and naturally handsome. Both had ex-lovers and a poor track record at monogamy, so they decided to have an open relationship. While they had a torrid sex life together, they enjoyed the novelty and sometimes the convenience of strangers and new friends. They didn't want to leave life in Mobile. They felt like they needed to leave. On March 21st, 1981, two Klansmen kidnapped 19-year-old Michael Donald as he walked to a store. Henry Hayes and James Knowles were enraged that a black man on trial for killing a white police officer in Birmingham had been freed. The men cut Donald's throat and hanged him from a tree on Herndon Avenue, not far from where Joey and Dwight lived. They had picked Donald at random and lynched him as a threat to other black citizens of Alabama. Other Klansmen burned a cross on the city's courthouse lawn that evening. This is 1981. Joey worked for the city of Mobile, while Dwight tutored, but those jobs weren't worth their safety. The Klan had begun to encourage violence against gays and lesbians in its propaganda. The couple checked out other cities, but only Atlanta seemed like a good fit. After a raucous New Year's Eve at Backstreet, they decided it would be home. In the spring, Dwight took off for Atlanta to find work and an apartment. He met and bonded with Hardwick over pinball games at the Cove. They grew as close as any two men who knew each other for that long could. On the night of August 2nd, 1982, Hardwick took Kirk Slusser's keys, put him in a cab, and told the driver to take him to 811 Ponce de Leon Place, his home. Slusser was there when Hardwick came home from work that morning, along with a few others who drifted out as dawn approached. By morning, everyone but Slusser and Dwight Sawyer had left. Sawyer had planned to go back to Mobile that afternoon to get his partner and to bring him back to Atlanta. He and Hardwick had retired to the bedroom where they smoked some weed and undressed. Sometime before noon, Officer Torek parked his police cruiser in front of Hardwick's house and walked up the concrete steps to the front door with what he believed to be a valid warrant. He approached the front door. Sawyer would recall that it had been left open, but Kirk Slusser, who was a friend sleeping on the couch, would recall that he did not let the officer in, that the officer came in on his own. Startled by the encounter, Slusser didn't know that he had the right to turn the officer away. He grew paranoid that the officer might find the marijuana drying in the kitchen. He told Torek that he didn't know if Hardwick was in, but that he might be in his bedroom. While the officer walked to the back of the house, Slusser staggered to the kitchen and tried to hide the weed. During the night, the bedroom door had been closed. Hardwick's room had the only air conditioner in the house, and when Sawyer had gone down the hall to the bathroom, Hardwick asked him to shut the door. Torek briefly paused outside what he stated was a door slightly ajar. Hardwick heard a noise and looked up, and seeing no one, resumed having oral sex with Sawyer. Torek, on the other side of the door, said he saw two men for a moment engaged in mutual oral sex. After 35 seconds, Hardwick later said, he heard another noise, and in the dim light of a candle saw a police officer standing in his room. "My name is Officer Torek," he announced, "and Michael Hardwick, you are under arrest." "For what?" Hardwick demanded while he and his companion, naked, fumbled for composure, struggling through a haze of marijuana. "What are you doing in my bedroom?" Torek had a warrant for arrest, and though Hardwick had told him the warrant wasn't valid because the ticket had been paid, Torek persisted. "Doesn't matter," he said. He had acted in good faith. Hardwick asked Torek to leave while he and Sawyer dressed. The men were still naked and erect. As they slipped on clothes, Hardwick a light gray sweatshirt, Torek did not break his stare. Hardwick asked him to at least turn around. "I've already caught you," Torek told Hardwick. "Why should I bother?" Torek scanned the room and saw a small brown bowl of what he presumed was pot beside the bed, not more than a quarter ounce. He told them both that they were now also under arrest for possession, and since he did not ask any questions, he did not have to legally read them their rights. Hardwick pleaded with him and said he had proof of the fine that he had paid. If Torek would just call to verify that the receipt was at the Cove, or even drive by the Cove, he could prove that he had been compliant in the charge and the warrant. No, he would not, nor did he have to call, Torek told Hardwick. And as far as driving 2 blocks to the Cove for evidence, Torek said that he did not run a goddamn taxi service. Slusser watched as the men were taken away in the squad car, then scrambled to call others to find out what to do next. Torek drove to the police station on Ponce de Leon Boulevard. He had handcuffed the men to the floor in the back seat of the squad car, where they sat for more than a half hour while Torek went inside and spoke with his superior officers. The police debated whether Hardwick would be charged with solicitation and Sawyer with sodomy, and how they would be charged for the small amount of marijuana. When he returned, Torek told the 2 men they were headed downtown. "You're under arrest," he said, as they headed to the Atlanta jail. A dank, decrepit pile right out of a noir movie. The jail had been built in 1933 to hold 136 inmates, but its population swelled often to 3 times that. In November, a few months after the men were brought there, it was considered unfit for human habitation. Guards broadcast the arrival of fresh meat. "Hey, these guys are in for sodomy. Oh, it's going to be a good time in the bullpen tonight." Hardwick and Sawyer were moved from floor to floor of the jail while they overheard officers denigrate them. "Fags shouldn't mind," they said. "That's why they're here." Hardwick felt like he was being treated like an animal, in shock over what had happened. The police kept moving them around, announcing that they were in for cocksucking. Sawyer was freaking out. Hardwick was scared to death, worried that they'd be sexually assaulted in prison. All he wanted to do was to survive. At one point, an officer put them in a holding cell next to a payphone. Sawyer's pocket jangled with quarters from a night of playing pinball. First, he called his partner. Then he gave Hardwick a coin to call the Cove. He reached Lloyd Russell, who had Hardwick's receipt for his initial ticket, and within the hour, someone came to the jail to bail them out. But the police delayed processing them, and Hardwick and Sawyer were kept in a holding cell for about 4 hours before being moved again. The 2 weren't fingerprinted and processed until early evening, sometime between 6 and 8 p.m. Hardwick finally bonded out at about 10 p.m. for $325. Sawyer didn't have a similar connection to get bail money. After Hardwick got out, the guards changed their shifts. A black officer was instructed to put Sawyer in a communal cell, but put him somewhere safer instead. "I don't think you're going to have a very good time in here tonight," he said. "I'm taking you and putting you in a cell by yourself." Sawyer appreciated that small act of mercy. Hardwick was able to go where Sawyer was staying and get the cash that he had brought with him to Atlanta. Hardwick then took the cash to A&B Bonding across the street from the city jail and worked his charm on the bondswoman. He didn't own property, and he was on bond himself, but after appealing to the agent, he was able, with help from Lloyd Russell, to bond Dwight out for $275. In Mobile, Sawyer's partner, Joey Potter, had already gone down the street to some of the gay bars to take up a collection for bail money. Bartenders and next-door neighbors gave him money, and they could deal with the stray sex later. In the moment, Potter grew angrier as he rustled the money to pay back the kindness. He had been an activist in Mobile, and now he was furious. "We're gonna fight this," Lloyd Russell told the Cove crew without hesitation. Russell, who owned the Cove, was on his way to finishing his law degree. Even before that, though, Russell would go to the mat for his employees, paying for their medical bills if they got out of hand. Anything they needed to do to fight this arrest, Russell said he would do. The marijuana charge would be simple to handle. It was a $55 fine and 10 days in jail at the most. The sodomy charge would be far more serious. Georgia's law and sentencing guidelines would lead to 20 years in prison if Hardwick were convicted. "This is going to stop," Russell told his bartenders and barbacks. Hardwick's first court date for the sodomy charge would be the next morning at 9 a.m. The last 72 hours had been traumatic. His assault, his mother's panic, his sex life turned inside out, his arrest. Frustrated and angry, shot through with new and unfamiliar fear, Hardwick had his doubts about a fight. It would be his life upended and no one else's. It was that fear that the state used to keep queer people in submission. The jail was only the most visible symbol of the carceral archipelago. Everywhere they turned, queer people faced the judges of normality who watched them, reported them, and had them punished. The state had built an apparatus that it used to constrain them. Once that apparatus had been built, it only took one operator to throw its full weight into action.
Thank you all for staying. This is now where many of you buy books and Marty signs them, but there is a special treat that I had not known about in this book.
Oh, yeah, the fabulous purple foil printing on the side. So I got my purple marker to match it.
Worth the price all by itself.
When we pulled those out of the box at home and we both did the same thing, opened up the jacket, my husband and I went, "Oh, that's nice." Yeah, that was unexpected. Thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it.
A couple of you reserved copies and I think got them, but Chris Pomeroy, did you get your copy? Are you here, Chris?
I didn't see Chris come in. Is he here?
Well, someone else is gonna get that one. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to our online audience as well.